Hello, everyone. We're going to give it a few more seconds to allow a few more people to join, and then we'll get started. Thank you so much for your patience as we work through a few technical difficulties. Just for everyone's awareness, we will be recording this webinar and sharing it widely afterwards. So thank you so much. Okay, well, happy last day of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. We hope you had a wonderful month celebrating the community. And thank you so much for attending the 2022 National Poll of Asian American Non-Voters and Voters Briefing. The 2022 National Poll of Asian American Non-Voters and Voters breaks new ground and builds on previous polls of Asian American voters by getting at the heart of what motivates Asian Americans to vote, how they get informed to vote, and what prevents some Asian Americans from voting. While other surveys on Asian American voters have covered how they vote, this survey captures Asian American voters and non-voters' experiments with the voting process. We'll kick off the presentation by introducing you to our presenters. Then we'll hear from the report author, Taeku Lee. Next, we'll hear from Terry Minnis, Senior Director of Census and Voting Programs at AAJC. With the remaining time, we'll take any questions, and any questions that we do not get to, we will be responding to via email. So let's get started. My name is Zaria Mari Kogan-Yard. I am the Manager of Census and Civic Engagement here at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. I'm joined by today's presenters, Terry Minnis and Taeku Lee. Terry is the Senior Director of the Census and Voting Programs for Asian Americans Advancing Justice. She was one of the key leaders in the campaigns to reauthorize the Voting Rights Act in 2006, as well as to address the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County v. Holder. Taeku Lee is a Bay Family Professor of Government at Harvard University. He has researched and written extensively on racial and ethnic politics, public opinion and political behavior, identity and inequality, and deliberative and participatory democracy. And with that, I will pass it to Taeku. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I deeply appreciate the opportunity to work on this project and to have the opportunity to share some of its findings with all of you today. I especially want to thank everybody at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, with whom I've had the privilege of working on this project with. Truly an amazing collaborative effort and far too many people to name individually, given the limited time that we have, but I just wanted to thank everybody. So Asian Americans, as I think we all know, are the fastest growing electorate in the United States. So between 2000 and 2020, the Asian American citizen voting age population grew roughly 245%, with a 300% increase in those registered to vote and a 345% growth in turnout itself. And in 2022, a midterm election where all other racial groups saw turnout levels that remained essentially the same or that decreased in comparison to the previous 2018 midterm, which was a record-breaking turnout year, the proportion of Asian American citizens who voted actually increased from 40.6% in 2018 to 41.5% in 2022. Yet, for as long as data on Asian American turnout have been available, turnout rates have lagged far behind those for non-Hispanic whites. So while Asian Americans have closed this gap somewhat over the years, in 2022, it remained the case that there was a 16 percentage point gap between the 57.6% turnout rate for whites and 41.5% for Asian Americans. So these background facts, together with a continuing politicized and racialized electoral climate that has been marked by widespread misinformation, election denialism, and a mass insurrection at the nation's capital, along with legislative efforts at the state level to address a voter fraud crisis that does not exist, and an ongoing intensification of anti-Asian American hate and hostility, These facts and factors all set the motivation for the national poll of Asian American non-voters and voters that I will present today. First, a few things about the survey. The total sample size for the survey was 2,800 Asian American citizens. There were essentially two different subsamples that I will present in turn. A sample of 2,100 voters and 700 non-voters. And you see here some of the ethnic breakdowns where we wanted to have at least 350 Asian Americans in the voter sample from each of 6 different ethnic subgroups, and then at least 350 Asian Americans in each of the 2 different buckets of the non-voter sample, which were Asian Americans who were registered but did not vote in 2022, and then Asian Americans who were citizens but were not registered in 2022. The interviews were done both online and with live telephone interviewers and in multiple languages, English and a select number of Asian languages. The key findings from the voter sample are the following. First, on overall evaluations of the midterm election, Asian American voters were overwhelmingly confident that every vote was counted in their state, overwhelmingly believed that elections were well run, and overwhelmingly said that voting for them personally was easy and not difficult. At the same time, a significant minority, 1 in 6, said that they felt threatened when they voted in 2022. The poll also included a wealth of findings on news and information in the 2022 election. So voters mostly relied on mainstream and social media sources for their news and generally trusted the outlets that they went to for their political news and information. At the same time, a majority of Asian American voters reported encountering what they believed to be misinformation in the 2022 elections. Asian Americans also continued to take advantage of different ways to vote, with the poll finding that an estimated 2 in 3 favored voting early or absentee rather than on election day. They favored voting early or absentee for many reasons, which we investigated. Chief among them were the long lines and limited hours that they anticipated on election day, COVID concerns, and then also the convenience and flexibility of voting early or absentee and scheduling conflicts with voting on election day. When they voted and had access to voting assistants like in-language assistants and poll workers at polling places, Asian Americans found voting assistance very helpful, but such assistance was not available for far too many voters. In terms of the role of contact and mobilization, 2 in 5 Asian American voters said they were contacted about registering to vote by parties and campaigns. But also important, we found, were efforts to contact Asian Americans by community-based organizations, by friends and family, and by neighbors and coworkers. Finally, as an important guidepost to what is to come, subgroups, whether by demographic background, ethnic origin, language, and so on, were mostly similar in their attitudes and experiences with voting, at least as the poll finds out. The most consistent exception to this in the data are differences by partisanship. And then after partisanship, you'll also see a recurring theme of differences by age groups or generation. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'll identify interesting and important subgroup differences as I go through the slide deck. Now, to how Asian Americans evaluated the 2022 elections. Let's start with confidence that every voter's ballot was counted in a respondent's state in 2022. As you see on the left, Asian American voters were overwhelmingly confident about ballots being counted in their state, or at least at the somewhat confident level. 92% were at least somewhat confident, and nearly 1 in 2 were very confident that every vote was counted. Election counts were quite controversial and polemicized in 2022. So on the right side of the figure, it shows partisan differences in confidence about vote counts. And it does show that Democrats were indeed more likely to be very confident, 56% compared to 38% for Republicans. But even among Republican Asian Americans, 87% were at least somewhat confident that every ballot in their state was counted. In terms of subgroups, we also find Asian Indians stood out for being very confident, as did those Asian American voters who were aged 60 and older. On how the elections were run, this positive evaluation in terms of confidence about vote counts also carries over to the next question we look at, which is whether or not Asian American voters thought the elections in their community were well run. Overall, 93% said the elections were at least somewhat well run, and a majority, 52%, said they were very well run in the community where they lived. Here, again, there are some interesting subgroup differences. Again, there are age differences. Asian American voters aged 60 and older were more positive on how the elections were run than those aged 18 to 30. There's also a notable and maybe predictable partisan difference. Republicans were substantially less likely to have a positive view on how the elections were run, only 37% saying they were very well run compared to 53% of independents and 57% of Democrats who said the same. A third look was on whether voting personally to Asian Americans was easy or difficult in 2022. The overall finding is consistent with questions about confidence and how well the elections were run. 94% of Asian American voters said voting was at least somewhat easy for them in 2022, and 58% said it was very easy for them. We again see a difference between younger voters and older voters, with 70% of those 60 and older saying voting was very easy for them compared to only 47% of those 18 to 30. The other notable subgroup difference to this question was by educational attainment, with higher educational attainment Asian American voters being more inclined to say that voting was very easy for them personally. Interestingly, on this question, there were no striking differences by partisanship or differences by nativity or language use. Overall, then, Asian Americans had a positive evaluation of the 2022 elections, those who voted, that is. Confident about all votes being counted in their state, well run where they lived, and for the most part, voting was easy, not difficult. Yet, when respondents were reminded about, quote, news stories about efforts to intimidate voters, 16% said they did feel threatened, either at or outside a polling place or a drop box location. Asian Indians, voters aged 18 to 30, and those with a high school level education or less were all subgroups that were more likely to say they felt threatened. This age effect further confirms a recurring finding that we will see that younger Asian American voters, who have really been a key to the rising tide of turnout for Asian Americans, tended to hold more negative views on the 2022 elections, especially by comparison to the boomer generation of those 60 and older. Let's turn next to how Asian Americans were informed in the 2022 elections. Asked whether they went for news and information, where they went for news and information about the elections, Asian American voters were most likely to get their news about the election from mainstream media sources, that is TV, radio, and newspapers. That's 71%. This is followed by social media for 48%, and then friends and family for 35%. Less common were voters who said they got their news from candidates and campaigns, from nonpartisan groups, and from Asian language or ethnic media. But that's still, those last three are still in the 10 to 19% range. It may surprise nobody here in the audience that younger Asian Americans, those aged 18 to 30, were much likelier to say they relied on social media. 79% in that age group said so, compared to those Asian American voters who were age 60 and older, only 21% of whom said they went to social media for their news and information. Then in terms of particular mainstream and social media outlets, there really is quite a diversity of outlets that Asian Americans voters go to for their news. Among mainstream media outlets, CNN is the most popular, followed closely by ABC News and then Fox News, and trailing by a little bit NBC News and then the New York Times, MSNBC, and NPR. Among social media sources, two outlets really dominate, Facebook and YouTube, 66% and 60%. 38% also went to Twitter, and a smaller but still significant number go to TikTok and WhatsApp. Importantly, we find that reliance on social media sources that are often associated with Asian American ethnic groups like WeChat, Kakao Talk, and Line was pretty much negligible. Now, election news is increasingly polarized, partisan, and characterized by citizens who self-sort into echo chambers and exposed to filter bubbles. Next, in the interest of time, I've hidden a few slides from the deck and in the report that show differences by partisanship in where Asian American voters go to for their news and information. And I'll just share aloud some of the main findings from those slides. First, it's certainly true, for instance, that Asian American Republicans are much likelier to check out Fox News, while their Democratic counterparts are much likelier to go, say, to CNN, New York Times, or MSNBC. What is notable about Asian American voters, however, is the extent to which the sorting is not seen as pronounced as it is for for Americans in general, say, compared to national data from studies by the Pew Research Center. So for instance, 26% of Asian American Democrats still say that one of their main sources of news is Fox News, and 31% of Asian American Republicans still say that one of their main sources of news is CNN. With social media, partisan differences are really minimal. YouTube and Facebook really dominate for Asian American Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike. Sorry, I got one slide ahead there. Next, wherever it is that Asian American voters go to for their news about elections, for the most part, they trust their news sources. As you see in this figure, a large majority of voters, 84% and 77%, say they trust mainstream and social media either a great deal or a fair amount. Roughly 1 in 4 trust their sources a great deal. At the same time, there are some key subgroup differences in trust in news sources by partisanship, age, and nativity. Democrats, those who are older than 60, and those born in the United States are all more likely to say they trust their news sources. While it's reassuring that most Asian Americans have at least a moderate degree of trust in the media outlets that they rely on for news and information about the elections, we have to remember that the 2022 election was saturated with content that raised alarms about misinformation and disinformation. So how aware and concerned were Asian American voters about their possible exposure to misinformation? Asked how often they encountered a story that they thought might have been made up or that might have included misinformation, a majority, 59%, said at least somewhat often, and 16% said very often. Younger voters, US-born voters, and Asian Americans who identified as Republican were all somewhat more likely to say they thought they had encountered election misinformation in 2022. The poll followed up this question with 3 additional items that delved deeper into the election environment in 2022. In the interest of time, these are not shared here, but let me summarize what they had to say. First, survey participants if they encountered incorrect information about the first survey participants were asked if they encountered incorrect information that was about the voting process in this election itself, and then given information, examples about such as misinformation about voting dates and deadlines, locations, qualifications, information about voting early or absentee. So to the question about whether they had encountered incorrect information about the voting process itself, 19% said yes to this question. Younger voters were especially likely to say they had encountered such election-related misinformation in 2022. Second, respondents who said they believed they had encountered misinformation were asked whether that misinformation was in an Asian language. To this question, 18% said yes. Chinese Americans, Vietnamese Americans, and those who primarily spoke an Asian language at home were especially likely to say yes. And then third, respondents were asked whether they encountered a specific kind of misinformation, which were online stories or leaflets and flyers that warned about threat of violence or rioting on election day. 16% said they did encounter such stories, and Asian American voters who were aged 18 to 30 were especially likely to say yes to that question. Turning now to evidence about how Asian Americans voted in 2022. On how Asian Americans voted in 2022, the poll estimates that 60% did not vote on election day. Rather, 42% reported voting absentee, and 24% said they voted early, but in person at an early voting location. Only 34% voted on election day. As you see also in this slide, by age, voters aged 60 and older were more likely to vote absentee and less likely to vote on election day. By nativity, naturalized citizens were more likely to vote on election day, while US-born citizens, voters were more likely to vote absentee. And then by partisanship, Democrats were somewhat more likely to vote absentee, while Republicans were more likely to vote on election day. Voters who indicated that they had voted absentee or early were then asked which among many possible reasons were the reasons that led them to vote absentee or early. 4 reasons were dominant among voters surveyed in our poll. Asian Americans preferred to vote early or absentee in order to avoid long lines and limited hours that they anticipated on election day. That's 44%. They were more likely to vote early or absentee if they had COVID-related safety concerns. That's 39%. If they preferred the convenience and flexibility of absentee voting, that's 35%. And or if they had scheduling conflicts related to work, school, or caregiving, that's 31%. 12% also checked off that they were concerned about being harassed or intimidated at the polls, and 12% mentioned uncertainty about where to vote as a reason why they voted early or absentee. And the slide deck also includes some interesting subgroup breakdowns for these top 4 reasons that you see in this slide for why Asian Americans voted early or absentee, which I will summarize rather than showing the slides. The key results here are the following. Younger voters are especially likely to choose to vote early or absentee due to scheduling conflicts, and less likely to see convenience and flexibility as a key reason. By contrast, older Asian American voters are less likely to note scheduling conflicts, but are particularly likely to select the convenience and flexibility of voting absentee or early. Older voters also seek to avoid the long lines and limited hours of voting in person on election day. High-income voters, which we characterize as those earning more than $100,000 a year, are especially likely to favor voting absentee or early because of the convenience and flexibility it affords. By comparison, those earning less than $40,000 a year were more likely to cite COVID safety as their main reason for voting early or absentee. There's a similar pattern here by education, where voters with a college degree or higher are more likely to appreciate the convenience and flexibility of voting early or absentee, while voters with a high school level education or less noted scheduling conflicts and COVID safety as reasons for voting early or absentee. In terms of nativity and language, naturalized citizens and voters who primarily speak an Asian language at home were more likely to cite COVID safety concerns as a reason to vote early or absentee. Finally, differences by party affiliation were modest. Democrats are slightly likelier to favor the convenience and flexibility of early and absentee voting, and slightly likelier to note scheduling conflicts due to work, school, and caretaking. Turning then to mobilization and contact in 2022. On sources of contact, survey participants were asked whether any of the following people or organizations had contacted them about registering to vote. The figure in this slide shows that contact from campaigns and parties is more frequent than any other sources of contact, 40%. At the same time, 25% of voters also reported contact from nonpartisan organizations, 33% from a friend or a family member, and 22% had been contacted by a coworker or a neighbor about registering to vote. If you combine all four, both organizational and informal sources of contact and mobilization, 58% of Asian American voters had been contacted by some entity in the 2022 election about registering to vote. In terms of subgroup differences, Asian Indians were the likeliest among ethnic subgroups to have been contacted by campaigns or parties, 47%, while Japanese Americans were the least likely to have been so contacted, 32%. Younger voters, those aged 18 to 30, were also twice as likely as those aged 60 and older to have been contacted by a campaign or a party. And finally, US-born voters were much likelier to have been contacted by a campaign or party than were naturalized voters. In terms of partisan differences in contact by a campaign or party, this figure in this slide shows that Asian American voters were most likely to be mobilized by Democrats, 44%, followed by voters who were contacted by both parties, 39%. It is worth noting that mobilization from campaigns and parties is quite targeted. So we also find that 60% of Democratic identifiers were only contacted by a candidate or campaign from their party. And similarly, 52% of Republican identifiers were only contacted by Republican candidates or campaigns. For independents, the majority were contacted by both parties. I'm going to skip this slide. Next, looking at voter assistance. We all know that different kinds of voter assistance, from voter guides and other materials on the process of voting to election day poll workers, are especially important for the Asian American electorate. Because the Asian American population is majority foreign-born, because many are first-time registrants and first-time voters, and because many have limited English proficiency, in-language assistance and voter assistance in general is especially important. So the poll assessed both the availability and use of language assistance for Asian Americans in 2022. First, on whether Asian in-language assistance was available, roughly half, 52%, said yes. The differences between ethnic subgroups are mostly minor here, but survey respondents who regularly spoke an Asian language at home were more likely to say language assistance was available to them than those who regularly spoke English. In terms of language assistant use, for respondents who indicated that Asian in-language assistance was available, the poll next asked if they used that assistance when they voted in 2022. And overall, 41% of voters who reported that in-language assistance was available to them used that assistance. Asian Americans with a high school degree or less were likelier to use in-language assistance than those with a college degree or higher. And Asian Americans who earned less than $40,000 in annual household income were much likelier to use in-language assistance than those earning $100,000 a year or more. That comparison is 57% to 25%. In terms of language assistance used by language and nativity, voters born in the United States were roughly equally likely to use in-language assistance as naturalized citizens. We also found that voters who primarily speak an Asian language at home were likelier to use in-language assistance than those who did not, 46% to 35%. And voters who chose to be interviewed in an Asian language were much likelier to use in-language assistance than those who chose to be interviewed in English, 62% to 34%. For respondents who indicated that Asian in-language assistance was not available, that's 48% of our voting sample. The poll next asked if such assistance would have been helpful to them in the 2022 elections. And here, overall, 39% indicated that such language assistance would have been at least somewhat, if not very, helpful. Those with a high school degree or less were much likelier to see language assistance as helpful than those with a college degree or higher, 56% to 36%. In addition, there are important differences by naturalization and language. We find that naturalized voters, those who spoke an Asian language at home, and those who chose to be interviewed in an Asian language were all likelier to say language assistance would have been helpful. So those are the key findings from the 2,100 completed interviews of Asian Americans who reported voting in the 2022 election. In addition, this was a national poll of Asian American non-voters and voters. So there is a non-voter sample of 350 individuals who said they registered to vote but did not vote in 2022, and an additional 350 individuals who said they were citizens, but they did not register to vote in 2022. So there's a 700-person non-voter sample in this poll as well. What does confidence in the 2022 election look like for non-voters? Here, the poll finds that while a strong majority of non-voters were at least somewhat confident in the election counts, the levels of confidence were measurably lower than among voters. So while only 8% of voters felt not too or not at all confident that every ballot was counted in their state, 23% of citizens who remained unregistered, and 26% of those who were registered but did not vote felt not too confident or not confident at all that every ballot in their state was counted. These two groups of non-voters were also substantially less likely to be very confident that every ballot in their state would be counted. Instead, the most common answer among these two groups of non-voters was that they were somewhat confident. On trust in election coverage, survey participants were also asked, this is in the non-voter sample, to think about their sources of news and prompted for their level of trust and confidence that the information was full, fair, and accurate. In this slide, the views of non-voters are compared to voters on media trust. Large majorities of non-voters, both registered and not registered, trusted their sources of news about the election either a great deal or a fair amount, 62% and 63%, combining those two categories. But it's important to note that these levels are considerably lower than the trust that Asian American voters had in their media sources, which, if you combine a great deal and a fair amount, is 79% of voters. In terms of the information environment for non-voters in the 2022 election, this slide compares voters to both groups of non-voters and their information sources. As with voters, non-voters go to mainstream media and social media more so than any other sources for their election news. At the same time, there are a few notable differences. The first of these is that non-voters are less likely to get their election-related news and information from candidates and parties than are voters. So 21% of voters reported candidates and parties as an important source of information, while only 11% of those who were registered to vote but did not turn out said the same. The other notable difference here is reliance on social media. Both registered non-voters and citizens who were not registered were somewhat more likely to say they used social media sources to stay informed about the elections than voters. So registered non-voters were also less likely to report using mainstream media sources than either voters or registered non-voters. In terms of particular media outlets, the figures here show that for non-voters, their main sources of information from mainstream and social media outlets look resoundingly similar to what we saw earlier for voters. The rank ordering for both mainstream media outlets and social media outlets for non-voters is essentially the same as it was in the earlier slide for voters. Again, as I did before, in the interest of time, the slide deck also shows differences in terms of particular media outlets by partisanship, and the report shows it by ethnic subgroups. I'll skip these slides for now and just discuss aloud what were the main highlights of those slides. As with voters, the reliance on different outlets varies by partisanship, but not as much as it does for adult Americans in general from studies done by Pew Research Center. While Asian American non-voters who identify as Democrats are likelier to go to CNN for their election news, and Asian American non-voters who identify as Republicans are likelier to go to Fox News, it's still the case, we find, that 1 in 3 non-voting Democrats still go to Fox News, and 1 in 3 non-voting Republicans still go to CNN. And the story is much the same with social media outlets. Asian American non-voters are largely similar to voters. Facebook and YouTube dominate for Democrats, independents, and Republicans who did not vote in 2022 alike. As with voters, Asian American non-voters who identify as Republicans appear slightly more reliant on Facebook and YouTube and slightly less reliant on Twitter than Asian American non-voting Democrats. Now, we saw earlier that a dominant majority of voters trusted their media sources that they relied on for their election news and information. What about non-voters? The figure here shows that large majorities of non-voters, both registered and non-registered, also trust their sources of news about the election at least a fair amount. Combining a fair amount and great deal, that's 76% and 71%. But note that this is still lower than the 84% of voters who trust their sources at least a fair amount. The lower trust levels for non-voters are especially large when you look at social media sources. So while 76% of voters said they trusted their social media sources that they relied on at least a fair amount, only 58% of registered non-voters had the same level of trust in their social media sources. Non-voters, again, both registered and non-registered, were much less likely to say they trusted mainstream media election news a great deal than were voters. While 27% of voters said they trusted the information from mainstream media sources a great deal, only 14% of non-voters said the same. And this gap is even greater with information from social media. 22% of voters said they trusted the information from social media sources a great deal, but only 7% of non-voters said the same. We also saw earlier that in an information environment that is increasingly permeated with unverified, unfounded, and sometimes even conspiratorial accounts of election news and events, a majority of Asian American voters believed that they had encountered misinformation. What about non-voters? In the main, we find there's very little difference between voters and non-voters. Among non-voters, Republicans were slightly more likely than their Democratic or independent counterparts to report seeing what they believed was misinformation in 2022. So 66% of Republican non-voters believe that, compared to 60% of non-voting Democrats and 56% of non-voting independents. As with voters, non-voters were also asked more follow-up questions about misinformation. Since one of the concerns for us is about misinformation designed to suppress voter registration and voter turnout, it's important to examine whether non-voters were especially likely to encounter perceived misinformation about the voting process itself, such as relevant dates and deadlines, where to vote, qualifications for voting, and so on. Here, the exposure to such perceived voting misinformation appears to vary quite a bit between Asian Americans who did not register to vote and those who were registered but did not vote. Citizens who were unregistered were more than twice as likely to report encountering what they perceived to be misinformation than those who were registered but did not vote, 22% to 9%. There is also a near twofold greater chance that someone with a high school level education or less is exposed to what they perceive to be misinformation than someone with a college degree or higher. And among those who were not registered, self-identified Republicans were much likelier to encounter what they believed to be incorrect information about the voting process than were Democrats or independents. As with misinformation about the voting process, it is also important to assess if non-voters were more likely to encounter stories about threats of violence or rioting on election day, which could also affect turnout. Here, the poll finds that, as with voting misinformation, Asian Americans who did not register to vote were more vulnerable to seeing stories on election day about election day riots and violence than were voters or non-voters who were registered to vote. Non-voters who were not registered and who had a high school level education or less were especially likely to see such stories. And so too were unregistered non-voters who identified as Republicans. Asian American non-voters were not more likely to encounter such stories about threats of election day violence than were Asian American voters. That's among those who were registered to vote but did not vote. Now, one key to sustaining momentum in increased election participation for Asian Americans is to examine whether there are any differences in how non-voters were contacted and mobilized compared to voters. Looking at different sources of contact regarding voter registration overall, non-voters were less likely to be contacted. I might need to be in this next slide. Were less likely to be contacted from each of the four sources asked about in the poll. So while 40% of voters were contacted by campaigns and parties, we find that only 31% of the unregistered citizens and only 26% of registered non-voters were contacted. Combining partisan contact with contact from nonpartisan or community organizations, 45% were mobilized by organizations of voters were mobilized by organizations, but only 36% of unregistered citizens and only 29% of registered non-voters were mobilized by organizations. Finally, adding contact from family and friends or contact from neighbors and coworkers, we found that 58% of voters were contacted from any of these four sources, while by contrast, only 50% of unregistered citizens and only 44% of registered non-voters were mobilized from any of the four sources. So in some, non-voters we find are measurably undermobilized compared to voters. But of course, this could be a chicken and egg dynamic where non-voters are less likely to participate in elections if they are less likely to be contacted, and groups are less likely to contact non-voters because they are less likely to participate in elections. So further research is required there. There are some interesting age differences in who is contacted that this slide shows. Here we see that non-voters aged 18 to 30 were likelier to be contacted by both campaigns and parties and by nonpartisan organizations than those who were aged 60 and older. These gaps are especially pronounced among registered non-voters. While 34% of 18 to 30-year-olds were contacted by a party or campaign in 2022, only 11% of those aged 60 or older were. Similarly, while 19% of the 18 to 30-year-olds were contacted by a nonpartisan community organization, only 9% of those aged 60 and older were. In terms of partisan differences in contact by a campaign or party, non-voters were far more likely than voters to report having been contacted by both a candidate or campaign from both Democratic and Republican parties. So 54% of registered non-voters and 70% of unregistered citizens were said they were contacted by both parties. If only one party contacted a non-voter, it was likely to be the Democratic Party. This is especially true for registered non-voters. 38% were only mobilized by a Democratic campaign or party, while only 8% were contacted just by a Republican campaign or party. Lastly, while turnout in the 2022 election remained high for a midterm election, maintaining high turnout rates will continue to be a challenge for Asian Americans. Many states continue to enact laws that make it harder for voters to register, for registered voters to remain registered, and for voters who would like to vote absentee or early to do so, among many of the restrictive provisions that we increasingly see. Potential voters in 2024 will also confront another polarized election with misinformation and a continued climate of anti-AAPI violence and hate. So sustaining hard-won gains in increased turnout will thus be a challenge in future elections. To assess the reasons why some Asian American citizens do not turn out to vote, even those who are registered to vote already, the survey gave respondents a lengthy list of potential reasons why somebody may not vote, and then directed to check all those that apply to them. Here, the most commonly chosen reasons are grouped into three kinds. Some reasons related to personal and environmental circumstances, some reasons that were barriers related to how elections are conducted, and finally, some reasons that were rooted in beliefs and attitudes about candidates, issues, and elections themselves. On personal and environmental circumstances that prevented an Asian American from voting, the most commonly mentioned barrier in 2022 was COVID safety concerns, 44%, followed closely by conflicting work, school, or caregiving schedules, 39%. An additional 19% noted that being out of town or away from home negatively affected their ability to vote, and a small but significant number of non-voters mentioned an illness or disability and bad weather or an unexpected emergency. The differences here between registered non-voters and unregistered citizens on how commonly these reasons were chosen was modest, if any. On reasons related to beliefs and attitudes about candidates, campaigns, and electoral politics itself, the most commonly mentioned barriers were insufficient information about candidates and issues, 43% mentioned that, and the belief that their vote, quote unquote, would not make a difference, 40% mentioned this. Registered non-voters were especially likely to cite these reasons for not voting in 2022. In addition to these top two reasons, 30% also noted that they did not vote because they didn't like the candidates or did not like their views on issues. 21% mentioned that they no longer believed that the political process works. And 16% said they did not see any candidates who represented Asian Americans or who spoke to AAPI issues. Finally, on election administration, on some aspect of how the election was conducted and how that affected one's vote in 2022, the most commonly mentioned reason by far was long lines and limited hours that people expected to find on election day. 40% chose this reason. Registered non-voters were likelier to note this as a reason for not voting than were those who were not registered to vote. The second most common reason related to election administration that was chosen was uncertainty about where to vote. 19% said that, followed by uncertainty about identification requirements to vote, concern about being harassed or intimidated or accused of voter fraud, and concerned about being turned away at a polling place or vote center. These findings show that many Asian Americans are deterred from voting for a complex set of reasons ranging from continued concerns about COVID safety to scheduling conflicts, the constraints of long lines and limited hours on election day, information gaps about candidates and the issues, as well as about where to vote and whether identification requirements are met. And finally, belief gaps about the difference that voting makes and whether the political process still works in the United States. Some of these salient reasons are unlikely to be as prominent in the next election, such as COVID safety concerns. And the poll also wanted to give non-voters in the study an opportunity to think about their participation in future elections. So here, respondents were asked what factors would be most important in enabling them to vote the next time. They were given 12 reasons and directed to select up to 3 from that list. So to this question, there are 3 most commonly chosen keys to voting in the next election. Most common among those was getting accurate, credible information about the issues and the candidates, which 49% of non-voters selected. Another 47% said having better candidates to choose from would get them out next time. And 36% said that getting time off of work or school or their caretaking duties would be helpful to their turning out to vote next time. A sizable but smaller number of non-voters also mentioned challenges and beliefs that would be key to their active participation, with 26% saying having renewed belief that my vote makes a difference, 23% saying having renewed belief in our political system, and 23% saying having trust that my votes are accurately counted would be a key to their voting the next time. Additional research into how non-voters define and understand the meaning of things like making a difference and belief in our political system and trust that my votes are accurately counted will be important, as different drivers could be motivating these concerns, such as increases in efforts to suppress voting within communities of color. To sum up then, the 2022 National Poll of Asian American Non-Voters and Voters offers a unique and uncommon look into the beliefs and experiences of the Asian American electorate in the 2022 midterm elections. A large majority of both voters and non-voters were confident about the elections, that every ballot would be counted, that the election was well run. At the same time, we also find that a large majority of Asian Americans continue to opt for alternatives to voting on election day, with 2 to 3 reporting that they voted early or absentee. Voters and non-voters alike relied on a variety of mainstream and social media outlets for their news and information. Most of Asian Americans in both groups trusted their news sources at least a fair amount, but voters being much likelier to trust their sources than non-voters. At the same time, A majority believed that they had encountered election-related misinformation, at least somewhat often. The poll also finds that voting assistance was widely used by voters, but not always available to them. 1 in 2 reported that in-language assistance was available, and 2 in 5 reported that using that assistance when it was available to them. Then contact and mobilization continues to be a vital part of the story for Asian American turnout. Non-voters were significantly less likely to have been contacted than voters. Non-voters cited scheduling conflicts, long lines, and limited hours that they anticipated on election day, insufficient information about the candidates and the issues, and the belief that their vote would not make a difference in elections as key reasons for not voting in 2022. Non-voters also cited as keys to voting in the next election, getting accurate and credible information on issues and candidates, having better candidates to choose from, and getting time off from work or school or their caretaking duties. Thank you. And I believe it's now over to Terry.
Thank you, Taeku, for sharing all of this excellent information. We will take a couple extra minutes just to go ahead and answer the questions we have in the Q&A. Just real quickly, I just wanted to help connect everything that Taeku had presented with why we had this survey taken, also policy connections moving forward. And so I think a lot of what we heard was proof positive that our work around expanding access to the ballot is very critical for the Asian American community, right? So making sure that we have universal or no excuse absentee voting, that there are opportunities to vote by mail, that there are opportunities to vote early, and that there are a lot of options for people to engage. Also, we know and have seen that providing language access is particularly critical for our community, that we will need to move in a proactive way, if you will, about combating mis and disinformation, particularly around our elections. And we also know that community education and engagement will be very important to making sure that our community is engaged for the 2024 election and beyond. And as Taeku mentioned, there's certainly further research that could be done to understand this even more. But we hope that this information can help you as you look to engage your community members, engage your elected officials on policies that would really improve and increase access for our community members. And with that, I will ask Taeku if you could respond to a number of these questions, and I'm going to group some of them. So one question was around regional differences that you may or may not have seen in the data, and there are a couple of different pieces, but I do know that there's some more detailed information in the report, but also any thoughts you have around regional differences that you may have seen while looking at the data.
Sure, that's a very important question. I think a couple of things to know. One is with a representative survey of Asian Americans nationally, it's always going to be difficult to drill down into particular regions, especially if you're talking about geographies that are at the state level or smaller. What the survey does allow us to do is look in general terms at whether, I think we collected data on 4 regions of the country and ensured that there was enough sample in each of the 4 regions. So Northeast, South, Midwest, and then West. There are some interesting differences, but a lot of them require a deeper dive into the data analysis itself. So for instance, there are differences by region in terms of voting early or absentee, some of which may have to do with differences by region and by states in terms of the availability of absentee and early voting, or, in the case of Oregon, sort of the universal availability of that. So that requires just further analysis, and our data allows us to look at regional differences, at least in these 4 chunks.
Great, thank you. And the last question I will give you, Taeku, is around ethnic media. There's 2 questions. One question around that is, were naturalized citizens more likely to rely on ethnic media And then what was the general trust level in ethnic media?
Yeah, so I think, well, on the second question, we did not ask about whether or not Asian Americans trusted ethnic media specifically, but I think the data allow us to look at Asian American voters and non-voters who said that they relied on ethnic media and then assess their level of trust in the media sources that they use. I'd be happy to look at that data, and if the questioner wants to follow up, share out what the data have to say on that. In terms of whether there are differences between US born and naturalized citizens in terms of their reliance on ethnic media, I don't recall if there was a difference, and I'm going to interpret from that if there was a large difference, I would have remembered it. And so the differences, if they exist, are probably relatively modest.
Great, thank you. And I do appreciate everybody for staying on a couple minutes after. Paul, I see your question in the chat. I think that if you would like to take a look at our report, I do know there's a methodology section, and certainly reach back out to us if that doesn't answer the question that you have. Thank you everybody for joining us, and for those hardy folks who were able to stick through, thank you, Taeku, for all your great work and for sharing all of this information. Again, we will be sharing information after this briefing is done, and we'll include links to the report and to the slide deck and to the recording and so forth. We are super excited to be able to share this information with you, and we look forward to working with you all on all of these important issues moving forward. Please feel free to contact us if you have any further questions, or if you would just like to talk about any of these issues more. So thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you.